A few months ago, my boyfriend and I went out to dinner where he ordered a steak. The waiter then asked him how he'd like the steak. And since he was really hungry, he cheerfully replied, "Oh, extra large, please." Very quickly did he realize what the waiter was really asking him was if he wanted it rare, medium, or well done. We've all probably had an embarrassing story like this where miscommunication happens. And that's because even though communication is something we do every day, it's hard and we often get it wrong. Transfer this into the workplace with teams across geographies, varying amounts of context, and sometimes clashing immediate goals, and it just gets harder. How do you bring others up to speed? Who are the relevant people you need to be communicating to? What do you include that is meaningful to them? In an organization, communication occurs at all levels. There's the communication that you do within a team, which tends to be more detailed and assumes context. At this level, you might use well-established tools and practices like Slack, Jira, or stand-ups to stay on top of each other's work. But then there's communication you need to do outside of the team, to dependent teams and stakeholders, where the thought leadership isn't as developed. The most frequently recurring need for communication at this level is to keep others in the loop on what you're working on by communicating on status. Today, this is commonly solved by fragmented spreadsheets, long presentation decks, or the dreaded status meeting. And it can get even more complicated because when you communicate outside of your team, there's multiple layers of audience, and the granularity of your communication and where you provide it may be nuanced based on how close your audience is to that project work. For example, an executive might want the 10,000-foot pole view of how work is tracking to a company outcome on a 2x2 Confluence page, whereas a dependent team impacted by the project may need to have key changes called out in a weekly update. What makes team-to-team communication especially hard is, firstly, teams are distributed both physically and digitally. Technology has brought the opportunity to be global, but this introduces the juggle of multiple time zones and geographies, which increases the friction to stay aligned synchronously. We've also seen an explosion of tooling options that's given teams the autonomy to choose which tools work best for them. When teams are working in different tools, though, it becomes even harder to weave those dependencies together. Digitally enabled teams are moving faster than ever. As organizations scale quickly, teams lose context, and it becomes impossible to loop into every decision or every conversation and action across every team. Conversations often get lost in the noise of Slack messages. And lastly, in a remote and async world, it's even harder to identify which teams you need to be talking to. Information feels more siloed, and context is then further fragmented across teams. So at this point, you could all be thinking, yep, all well and true, but why should I care? My product manager owns the talking to other teams for us, or as a project manager, it's my job to handle this on behalf of my teams. So I'll grin and bear it. But communication should be everyone's job. When every individual takes responsibility in reinforcing it, it becomes a stronger driver to effective collaboration. The issue is that the impact of poor team-to-team communication isn't often realized until it's too late. Teams may look at it and think of it as a status reporting, the most boring thing ever, and think, God, what a waste of time that is, because it feels like it doesn't contribute directly to solving a problem for your customer. So what ends up happening is they try to avoid it altogether or get it over with without putting much thought behind it. But over time, a lack of meaningful communication between teams will result in painful costs. Teams working on the same things without realizing. Wasted investment in the wrong requirements, and misalign efforts that don't move the needle on shared outcomes. To help us navigate these challenges at Atlassian, we leverage a simple framework for healthy and effective team-to-team communication called the loop. The loop is an agreed-upon way of working based on 4 core beliefs. And those 4 core beliefs are: firstly, open up your work in progress by writing a weekly update to create a predictable, synchronized operating rhythm across physically distributed teams. Common vocabulary over common tooling to form alignment across digitally distributed teams through shared context, rather than forcing them to standardize in one tool. Curation over automation to tailor your updates to your audience's context. And lastly, show that you're paying attention to engage teams in conversations rather than one-sided broadcasts. For this talk today, I'm going to double-click on belief number 3, curate over automate, to share a toolbox of tangible best practices when sharing updates asynchronously, so it feels less like writing that dreary status report and more like curating a delightful morning tweet. I want to preface that these suggested tips are tool agnostic, so you could start practicing them today in Confluence, in Slack, even in your spreadsheets. But what's important is adopting this way of working rather than a specific tool. But in classic Atlassian style, of course, our team was so passionate about this that we built a tool that embeds these practices into the product to make it easier to adopt the loop. It's called Atlas, and it's a teamwork directory that helps you connect the dots between work, people, and knowledge. It is available to customers today, and it's free for unlimited users. So check out this link later if you want to have a play around yourselves after the talk. Now, let's get started on those simple techniques to curate an effective asynchronous update. To help you visualize these in practice, let's use the example of an imaginary company. Introducing Speak Easy, a language learning app working on releasing their iOS version to the market. A couple of weeks leading up to their launch date, the engineering team provides this update to their stakeholders in design, marketing, and legal. At first glance, is this a useful and engaging update for you? I don't know about you guys, but when I see walls of text like these, my eyes tend to glaze over a little. So let's see if we can make this a more effective piece of communication. First, let's keep it short. Isn't it ironic that often the best and hardest communication is one that delivers the message in as little words as possible? Your stakeholders likely need to stay on top of multiple streams at a time, and for every project that has some long-winded report detailing everything that happened like the one you saw before, that's more time taken from their priorities. For example, in Atlas today, we know that there are some users who follow more than 40 projects. If they had to read a status report like that for each one, that could add up to 6.5 hours of reading time each week just to keep updated. When it comes to a progress update, the majority of your stakeholders simply need to know, is the work on track? When is it expected to land? What does this mean for me? In Atlas, we actually constrain updates to 280 characters, the length of a tweet. Combined with that, we encourage the frequency to be weekly, so progress can be consumed in consistent bite-sized pieces. To help you figure out how to communicate the most important things for your stakeholders, think of the communication pyramid. When forming an update, you may have lots of brainstormed points, which you then group into important themes and synthesize into a headline. For most outside stakeholders, that headline is sufficient to stay informed. So in our Speak Easy example, stakeholders probably don't care about the number of stories you've completed, what individual teammates were doing, or the specifics of challenges faced, more than simply knowing that the team has encountered friction which may slow them down. So once we remove that unnecessary detail, you can see that this update already becomes much friendlier to digest. But there's still more that we can improve on here. Call out changes early and often. Have you heard of the idea of watermelon projects before? These are projects that appear green, on track week by week, until you hit that week of the deadline and suddenly things reveal to actually be red. The problem is there's often this feeling of fear when calling out to outside stakeholders or execs that a project is off track. So updates tend to be sugar-coated. This isn't useful at all for enabling stakeholders to jump in and help early, or for dependent teams to plan accordingly. There are two ways we believe in resolving something like this. The first part is culture. We need teams to feel psychologically safe to share progress transparently when things aren't going well or no progress has been made. Encouraging teams to flag risks early, reset expectations by changing the target date or status early and often means more time to resolve them or pivot when things don't go to plan. And that's all in the nature of being agile. The second part is creating a cadence for frequent updates so you have more opportunities to call out and resolve these risks. This is the most important information stakeholders care about in a progress update. So flag them as the top headline and add commentary as to why the target date or status has changed, so that stakeholders know if there's anything they can do to jump in and help unblock you. Now let's keep on refining this update. Focus on outcomes, not outputs. A big feedback request we often get in Atlas is teams wanting to automate their status updates based on Jira data connected to their sprint. This would include information like tickets completed, progress percentage, bugs raised, and more. But when we dig deeper into what the audience really cares about, there's this quick aha moment that progress updates are not that particularly useful with that level of detail. Great, your project is 75% complete, but what does that actually mean? If unexpected scope is added to the project the following week, does that mean your progress is now going backwards? So rather than automating updates, we strongly believe in the effectiveness of curation. So updates contain the so what as opposed to just the what. So in our example, let's ditch that progress percentage metric so readers can focus more on the actual outcomes. Now, how else might we improve this update? Well, we can drop the jargon. Decoding written communication is always harder than verbal, given the lack of tone, body language, and context clues. Adding jargon increases that difficulty on cognitive load, requiring your audience to have context to translate and make sense of your communication. When communicating to a wide audience, the rule of thumb is it's always helpful to assume your reader has no context to your work. Your progress updates may have many different teams and dependencies with varying levels of context. So to avoid this simple miscommunication, sense check what you've written from the eyes of someone with no context to the work and ask yourself, does this make sense if I'm seeing it for the first time? Is there any terminology that I might be unfamiliar with? What would this update mean for me? The easiest thing to do is avoid acronyms or define them up front so that everyone is on the same page speaking the same language. Great. So now this update is starting to look like it's making more sense. How do we make it more engaging though? Well, we can use visuals. You know what they say, a picture says 1,000 words and video even more. For example, here is some text explaining the first, second, and third dimensions. A pretty confusing concept to understand here. But what if we added this visual to support it? Then it becomes much easier and quicker to download. And this is because visuals tend to be much more engaging and simplified than text. In fact, the human brain processes images 60,000 times faster than text. So adding rich media like mock designs, diagrams, or demos to your updates will boost your readers' ability to digest it better. For example, rather than telling your stakeholders what you built, show it in a Loom demo so they can see that exact experience. Now this update is starting to look pretty good. Let's keep going. Normalize emojis. Fun fact, emojis are the fastest growing modern day language around the world, and they can be very useful to conveying tone and sentiment asynchronously. As companies become more globalized, it's more important than ever to keep teams aligned on a common vocabulary so you're on the same page in terms of what you're discussing. Although emojis have historically thrived in a social environment, they are sneaking their way into the workplace as a medium to add relatability and color to your comms. Gone are the days where status reporting should be this dry wall of text. Introducing some of our daily digital habits into the status update experience can add delight for both project owners and readers. In our teams in Atlas, it's a fun ritual to actually get together at the end of the week and write our updates together. And we'll select wacky but relevant emojis to include, like a hot dog for our feature release to dog fooding, or a top hat when we released our top teams feature. While it might seem like a trivial tactic, adding emojis to your update can help boost engagement and force writers to focus their comms into key bullet-pointed headlines. This update just leveled up in engagement. So what can we do next? Choose the right level of granularity. We recognize that different audiences need different levels of detail. Not every stakeholder is going to get enough from a 280-character update. Some may want to dig in deeper. Others may even want a level abstracted. I've spoken about curating updates in headlines a lot so far, so to take that analogy further, a way to consider this is through the traditional newspaper. If you look at a newspaper's front page, it's a portal to more information. You get a high-level summary of the stories and a direction to go if you want to read about the whole story. So think of your core update as the high-level summary for your readers to decide if they're interested in digging deeper. Then include links out to provide opportunity to explore that detail. In Atlas, we support the ability to add a more detailed section in your update as well. So when published, this will display in a collapsed state, and the reader is given the power of whether they want to expand it or not. This helps cater an update to different audiences without having to recreate that update multiple times. And whilst this tackles the audience who wants to dig deeper into an update, what about the opposite, where your audience actually wants a level abstracted? In our research, we found that the further away a stakeholder is from the project team, the less granularity they are seeking in the communication. For example, rather than staying on top of 30 different projects at once, if your primary audience is an exec stakeholder, they may want to stay updated with just the aggregated outcome of the work or a topic area. For these audiences, communicating on the overarching goal is more informative than a bunch of individual projects. Establishing this terminology so your teams know when to report on a goal for longer running outcomes versus a project for incremental chunks of work will help them organize and communicate at the right level for the right stakeholders. And lastly, it is okay to have a no progress update. Some weeks, your honest update is going to look a little like this. And the reality is that there's going to be distractions, unexpected changes, and plans don't always follow through, and that is okay. The important thing is, rather than avoiding the update altogether, you can still keep stakeholders informed that there hasn't been progress made due to such reasons, and then leverage the weekly update as a way to reaffirm your status and your target date. So with those 8 easy techniques for team-to-team communication, we've taken the drag out of status reporting and transformed a dry email like this into something that is more meaningful, engaging, and effective to keep your stakeholders in the loop. Here is a quick recap on the techniques we spoke about today. Keep it short. Call out changes early and often. Focus on outcomes, not outputs. Drop the jargon. Use visuals. Normalize emojis. Choose the right level of granularity. And remind yourself that it is okay to have a no progress update. Communication, especially between networks of teams in this current age of modern working, is hard. But I hope that now you're armed with this toolkit of techniques, you'll be able to simplify that complex art of team-to-team communication. And for the first time ever, be able to say this non-ironically. Thank you.